I ended the previous video by showing you a map of global biodiversity hotspots, and I pointed out that they tend to be concentrated in equatorial regions. So there's a clear latitudinal gradient in biodiversity that is consistent for many different types of species, and this pattern holds for insects, plants, frogs, birds, mammals, and so on. Basically, we have greater biodiversity near the equator, and biodiversity decreases as you move from the equator to polar regions. And this is something that we're going to be exploring in more detail in this video. So to start, let's examine this pattern for butterflies, one of the best recorded insects in the world. People like butterflies. This figure here is examining the latitudinal gradient in butterfly species diversity in the Americas, so that's here on the left, in Africa and Western Europe in the center, and Australia and Eurasia on the right. And the latitudinal gradient in biodiversity is clearly seen in the Americas and in Eurasia, Australia. So biodiversity is highest at the equator and decreases towards the poles. This pattern is mostly apparent for Africa and Western Europe, again the center graph shown here, but with the exception of this anomaly of low biodiversity in Northern Africa that I've highlighted here with the red arrow. So any ideas on why this pattern might deviate from what is expected here? So what do you know about the climate and geography of Northern Africa that might give you a clue as to why butterfly biodiversity is lower here? So maybe I'll pause for a minute and let you think about that. Well, if you look at a map, this area here where biodiversity dips, this is the Sahara Desert. And this kind of exception to the rule is as exciting for biogeographers as seeing these patterns emerge themselves. So both instances here, instances where we can clearly see that latitudinal gradient in biodiversity, and this instant here where we have an exception to the rule, they both tell us something important about geographical controls on biodiversity. Now, we have this clear pattern, this clear gradient in biodiversity, highest at the equator, decreases towards the poles, largely consistent for most regions and most types of species. The why of this pattern, the why of latitudinal taxonomic diversity, is the mother of all biogeographic questions. And there are a few dominant hypotheses or theories that we're going to cover in this video. And as I go through each of them individually, what I want you to keep in mind is that the answer is likely due to many codependent factors, rather than any one hypothesis in particular being right. So the first one we're going to cover is the energy hypothesis. Basically what this means, more energy equals more organisms equals more species. And this is well supported for plants. It suggests that the critical factor determining that latitudinal trend that we see in biodiversity is the amount of energy that's captured by vegetation. Equatorial regions have more sunlight and water to support photosynthesis, gives us more plants, enables competition, specialization, and ultimately speciation. Now this is for primary producers, or plants, but it connects to higher trophic levels as well. So if you have more plant biomass and more plant differentiation or speciation, you have more habitat complexity. You also have more resources, and both of these factors are going to support higher trophic levels and more species diversity in general. Basically, this hypothesis claims that the rate of energy fixation by photosynthesis governs the growth, performance, and biodiversity of plants, then of herbivores, and so on through all the links of the food chain. Now, we can extend this reasoning beyond just thinking about latitude. So, for example, let's look at tree diversity in North America. So we can see that latitudinal gradient here in tree diversity is higher in the south, decreases as you go north. But really what we see is a strong longitudinal gradient in plant biodiversity, in tree biodiversity. So we have low species diversity in the Midwest and exceptionally high tree species diversity in the southeast. So the energy hypothesis that I covered in the last slide tells us that plant biodiversity is strongly correlated with climatic temperature and rainfall, which govern the rates of photosynthesis. So high tree biodiversity in regions of, so we would expect high tree diversity in regions of higher evapotranspiration. Also higher primary productivity in general in these regions. So this would explain why the southeast has such high plant biodiversity, because it's related to temperature and moisture. It's wetter in the southeast, warmer, wetter in the southeast, more plant biodiversity. So another way we can think about the energy hypothesis is in terms of productivity. High uniform temperatures and an ample supply of water, which is typical of many tropical equatorial regions, supports a high biomass of vegetation. This leads to a more complex structure in the layers of plant material, and this habitat complexity can in turn support high animal and plant biodiversity. So think back to ecosystem diversity that we covered in the previous video. So tropical areas experience diminished seasonal variation, so they have less seasonality than we do here in temperate regions. So without an annual fluctuation in resources, without having to think about overwintering, for example, species can concentrate on their niche food supply and reproductive strategy, rather than having to deal with things like temperate species would have to think about, like stockpiling food or hibernating, migration, synchronizing reproductive behaviors, or more generally, in temperate regions, species behavior and life history strategies are strongly dictated by the seasons. So if you have less seasonality, less hassle, more time for reproduction, which could contribute to greater competition and perhaps more diversity. But let's come back to this idea of habitat complexity. So let's look at habitat complexity from the standpoint of a forest, defining complexity as the number of forest strata. A tropical rainforest has high complexity, and in particular in terms of its vertical structure. So we talked about the 4 layers of vegetation in a tropical rainforest during the first half of term. It was also a question on your midterm. Tropical rainforests have the highest habitat complexity, which would support higher diversity of animals. Next in complexity would be coniferous and deciduous forests, for example, like we have here in Canada, followed by thorn or scrub forest, prairies, and then deserts. So what we would expect is that the species diversity of animals would decrease with this decrease in habitat complexity, with this decrease in the number of forest strata, or decrease in vertical complexity. And in many cases, this is exactly what we see. So this is a figure modified it's from an earlier version of your textbook. So in this graph here, you can see there are approximately 4 species of birds gained for every new tree strata added. So the y-axis is the number of bird species, or bird species richness, and the x-axis is the number of tree strata. So for every level of tree strata that you add, you have increased species richness of birds. So again, more habitat complexity, more vertical structure in your forest supports a greater species diversity of birds. But we also need to remember that complexity is in the eye of the beholder. So based on that figure that I showed 2 slides back, where we said that forest strata was related to habitat complexity, was related to species diversity. This picture here, from the prairies, would be a relatively simple environment, and we would expect low diversity. But this table here on the right shows the number of species of ants that can be supported in this environment. So to an ant, this is what habitat complexity looks like, and that's reflected in the high species diversity of ants. So this is the number of ant species captured in pitfall trappings in the South Okanagan. So again, complexity depends on the species in question or the group of species that you're talking about. So this habitat may not support as high a diversity of birds, but it can support a very high diversity of insects. Another theory that is used to describe the latitudinal gradient in biodiversity is metabolic theory. And just like energy theory is primarily related to biodiversity in plants, metabolic theory is specific to explain biodiversity gradients in animals. So metabolic theory states that latitudinal gradients in biodiversity for animals is greater due to greater metabolic rates in warm climates. So think about ectotherms for a minute. Ectotherms rely on external sources of heat. The reproduction and feeding of ectotherms is more efficient when it's warm and sunny, and much the same is true for endotherms as well, which regulate their body temperature metabolically. So when it's cold, endotherms have to burn more energy to maintain their body temperature. In warm weather, more of this energy is going to be put to other uses, for example, reproduction. Now, in practice, this relationship is more complex than a simple relationship with temperature. For example, just like the energy hypothesis, water availability also has to be taken into account. But it's a theory used for animal biodiversity that is similar to the energy hypothesis for plants. Rates of evolution have also been used to explain higher biodiversity in equatorial regions. So there's a question of whether or not evolution actually occurs faster in the tropics than it does in higher latitudes. And if evolution proceeds more rapidly under tropical conditions, then higher diversity at the tropics might just be due to the continual evolution of new species at a faster rate compared to higher latitudes. Now, evolution of new species is generally a process that occurs over longer timescales, and so historical biogeography can offer some insights here. Have the tropics acted as a center of evolution for groups of organisms in the past? Well, we can look at the angiosperms as an example, the flowering plants. So there's an astounding amount of biodiversity in the angiosperms. Angiosperms first rose to prominence in the tropics, and high species diversity of angiosperms has been maintained in the tropics since that time. So the latitudinal gradient for angiosperm biodiversity goes back a long way, which may offer some support for this idea of faster evolution in the tropics. And we can link this theory of faster evolution in the tropics back to metabolic theory. We can use metabolic theory to postulate why evolution might occur faster in the tropics. So we have evolution because we have genetic variation to act on, and genetic variation arises through genetic mutations in sexual reproduction. So metabolic rates tend to be faster where energy is abundant and temperature is consistently high, which could lead to higher fecundity or greater production of offspring, shorter generation times, and perhaps faster genetic modification by mutation. So if you have more reproduction occurring, the production of sexual gametes provide opportunities for genetic modification to occur, mutations to occur for evolution to act on. UV radiation can also induce genetic mutation, so tropical regions receive greater solar radiation. And then we have we're going to connect, it's not really one theory that is going to explain all of this, but likely all of them play some sort of role. So species diversity is higher in the tropics for a number of reasons. New variants that arise by faster mutation rates will be competitors. They'll have more species diversity, more species to compete with, which could drive natural selection, promoting further evolution. So it's a bit of a circular argument, but basically species diversity is higher. You have more competition, more specialization to minimize competition, and linking or completing the circle, therefore more species diversity. So evolution may be higher in the tropics. And the sort of flip side of that is that extinction rates might also be lower in the tropics, perhaps as a result of the legacy of glaciation. So an important difference between equatorial and high latitude regions is that the tropics were not covered by ice sheets during successive glaciations during the Pleistocene as the northern latitudes were. So maybe this means that extinction rates have been lower over the last several 100,000 years. So the tropics, apart from mountain ranges, were ice-free and subject to less obvious climatic stress, though they did still experience fluctuations in temperature and fluctuations in moisture availability. And this relatively greater climatic stability over the long term might have promoted the diversification of species. devastating climatic events to lead to high extinction rates. So if you have higher evolution rates that we talked about through things like metabolic theory, and you have lower extinction rates because of greater climatic stability, both of those things together work together to increase species diversity in equatorial regions, is basically what these two things are saying. Another interesting comparison between high latitude and tropical regions is that high latitude species tend to have a broader geographical range compared to low latitudes, something we call Rappaport's rule. So species diversity decreases as you increase latitude, but species ranges increases. Now, there's no statistical support for this to be considered a general global rule. And it has been suggested that this relationship could be the consequence of successive glaciations favoring more adaptable species. It could also be tied to dispersal ability. Species that were able to rapidly recolonize when the glaciers were treated were more successful. These species might have a greater tendency to have higher geographical ranges because of this good dispersal ability. But really, a far simpler explanation for this pattern is that the Rappaport effect is likely a consequence of latitudinal gradients and not in species richness, and not a potential cause of this gradient. So if you have lower species diversity in higher latitude regions, you have less competition for resources, and therefore the ecological and geographical ranges of species can be more extensive than it would be in a species-dense tropical region. So those are just some of the reasons why biodiversity may be higher in the tropics than it is in higher latitude regions. And I wanted to return, this is the last slide in this video, and I wanted to return to what I mentioned earlier, that we have this clear, interesting pattern in biodiversity, and it's exciting to see it supported, and it's exciting to explore the reasons why. But the deviations from this pattern can be just as interesting. So I thought I would end this video with an interesting exception to the latitudinal gradient in biodiversity. So aphids, a group of insects that have about 4,000, encompasses about 4,000 species, actually have an inverse relationship with latitude. Fewer species in the tropics compared to temperate regions. So what do we know about aphids that might help explain this? Aphid species tend to only feed on one plant type, and they're actually rather poor at locating it from a distance. So they're really relying on chance to encounter this one species that they've become specialized to. So aphids are going to be most successful when plant populations of a particular species are dense, such as areas where you have lower plant diversity and agricultural regions. So again, exceptions to the rule tell us something about controls on biodiversity just as much as the patterns do.